Number 15, Young Justice Season 2. My personal favourite of the Young Justice quadrilogy. Why do I like this one so much? Why do I like it more than the others? Because I feel it carries on that camaraderie that exists in the first season, but it adds a solid serial plot. I know there was a plot running through the first one, but it was sort of like a random adventures scattered here and there, and then eventually by the season finale, it all adds up and there's a big plot that's, a scheme that's been unfolding. Let's stop it now, and then that's the end. Don't get me wrong, I obviously love that first season, but second season of Young Justice has a much more tightly wound, obvious narrative running through it that is more appealing to me personally, and I also feel that it doesn't completely betray that sense of teamship, that sense of teamhood. There must be a word, whatever. It expands on the original team somewhat, and you get the whole thing about about Wally West retiring, and then what happens to Wally West? Well, we're still to find out. But that there was a whole plot there, and it was good. So that's why season 2 of Young Justice is as high as it is in this list that I made up, so I don't have to justify anything to anyone. Number 14, Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance, Season 1. This is another one that really surprised me how good I thought it was. I'd seen the Dark Crystal before, the movie, and not thought much of it. I watched it again in preparation for this show, and again, it's just not that good. Like, I sort of went, and I didn't watch the full thing, but I got clips of like the making of the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance documentary thing that was on Netflix, and everyone was talking about how magical and mystical the original movie was. It just isn't. It just is not. What Jim Henson can do with puppets is incredible. What he can do with writing and stories leaves a lot to be desired. It is the most bland, two-dimensional fantasy story that anyone has ever written. There is nothing interesting or original about it. It's just, look, the puppets look amazing, and that's it. What the Age of Resistance TV show does is it takes that basic setting, it adds, there's new technology, but a lot of it is still that sort of handiwork and the puppetry. It's just, I guess it's just Netflix just throwing a load of money into it and getting the best puppeteers and the best set builders and the best experts in whatever, the field of puppetry and what it needs to succeed. And then augmenting some of that, there is some CGI in there, but it's mostly to augment. They were dabbling with, is it going to just be, should we just do it all in CGI? And the answer is no, because it just doesn't look the same. It just doesn't look like puppetry. So this is a great little middle ground that they've got going, and it makes for a very unique show, because you don't see a lot of puppetry. You don't ever really see puppetry on this sort of scale before. This is like the apex of what puppetry has achieved as a medium for storytelling. But like the original, it doesn't work if the writing isn't very good, and I'm very pleased that they have massively expanded the scale of the story and the scale of the world. They've added more nuance, they've added more depth. It's not just a case of good and evil. It is really just a case of good and evil, but there is more complexity to the world, and that makes for a much more interesting story to be told in this setting. It gives it a lot more potential. I think like the two side by side are a masterclass of like the difference that creating an interesting world with interesting characters and interesting writing can make against something that is just bleh in terms of the story that it's trying to tell. You can have all the digital wizardry and puppeteering and visual majesty that you want, but if the story's not good, the story is not good. And luckily for Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, it overcomes that aspect of the source material. Number 13, The Crown, Season 3. The Crown is a show that I like despite myself. Whenever I see a news story online or on the TV or something about the royal family, someone's getting married, someone's having a baby, someone's fallen out with something, I roll my eyes, because I cannot fucking stand listening to anything about the royal family. So, a costume drama about the life of Queen Elizabeth II and her family and all that sort of shit that went on, and going on about her life and how wonderful she is. should be the last thing that I would ever enjoy watching. Despite that, The Crown is a very good show. It's good TV. There's no getting around it. Maybe the third season is a bit iffy, getting a bit fast and loose with some of the realities of, you know, the characters, and getting a bit sort of creative with some of the truths. But it's still good TV. There's a lot of debate about, you know, whether Olivia Colman is she portraying the Queen or is she portraying Claire Foy as the Queen. Personally, I don't care. I thought she was good. I thought she was really good regardless. I didn't stop to really think about, oh, is she too similar to Claire Foy? Well, that would kind of make sense because that's who she is ultimately supposed to be. An older version of Claire Foy's Queen. So there's an argument either way, really. I liked how they opened it with the whole stamp thing. You had a stamp of Claire Foy's face and they were updating it to Olivia Colman's face to mark the transition. It's a little bit awkward that you've got to know these characters in these roles for 2 whole seasons and then all of a sudden everything changes very sharply, very dramatically. I don't think there really was an easy way to do it. I think it was always going to be a difficult job of aging these characters up, but you know, you just got to look past it. And like, you know, halfway into the first episode, I'm already over it, really. I love the original actors and their performances, but you've got to move on. They've got more stories to tell, and they can't have Claire Foy playing an 8-year-old unless they do the weird aging up technology thing that still looks really strange and would push the show's incredibly ridiculous budget even higher. So probably not the best idea. This is how it's got to be done, and I think the show did it well. The best episodes of this season were the ones that featured around 2 completely different stories that happened in Wales. Aberfan was just like gut-wrenchingly emotional, and then the one about Prince Charles's investiture was an interesting, you know, it's an introduction to Prince Charles as a character who hasn't really featured that heavily until now. You know, I'm learning stuff. I'm learning history about the royal family, but about, you know, other things as well that happened in the 60s and the 50s and whatever. So I'm still enjoying it. I still think it's a really good show, despite not actually being a massive fan of the royal family in real life. Number 12, The Mandalorian, Season 1. From a show that I didn't think I was going to like based on the material to a show that seems like it has been aggressively tailor-made for me. I'm loving it. I'm really enjoying every aspect of it. Not necessarily because it's a Star Wars show. What I find strangely compelling, strangely interesting about it, which I didn't expect, is that it is very much a throwback to sort of like shows in the 1980s and earlier, 70s, 60s, 50s, these sort of like a man with a gun and he's gonna go into a town and he's gonna solve a problem in this town and then just move on to somewhere else. It's very old-fashioned. It's actually the show in my experience I correlate it with the most is Samurai Jack. The overall plot and the overall aims don't matter so much, and that's what a lot of people are struggling with. It's more about the individual episodic adventures that he gets up to, and I think all of them have been interesting so far. They've all been very entertaining, and long may it continue. I'm really into this. It's very much style over substance, but I don't really care at this point. I love me, you know, a good serialized drama with a million different plot threads that all interlink with each other and culminate in something after 60, 70 episodes. But I'm really on board with this whole episodic thing at the moment that The Mandalorian's doing. Whether the success of this show and the popularity of this show spawns a whole host of other episodic adventure series, and you know, bring on a wave of episodic shows, and eventually the novelty of it runs out and we're all screaming for, you know, proper serialized content again. Yeah, I wouldn't be looking forward to that, but as a one-off, as one show doing this high budget throwback to what seemed like a dead genre, yeah, that's interesting to me on that level alone. Besides all the Star Wars shit, I think that's a reason alone for The Mandalorian to be considered worthwhile watching. Number 11, Game of Thrones, Season 2. Bit of a gap between this Game of Thrones and the last one. I think I just had a quick look on the list and the last one was down in 33rd place, this one's in 10th. I feel that's completely fair. I think that it's a good barrier between the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, which were almost impeccable as a collective unit, and the last 4 seasons which were not. Why does Game of Thrones season 2 only come in at 10th then? Because I feel after the first one there is a loss of quite a number of the major players. Ned Stark obviously being principal among them, but also Robert Baratheon and Khal Drogo, and to a lesser extent Viserys. There was a lot of big names that had a lasting impact on the show that were lost in the first season, and it takes a while, I think, for the show to really find like its new leading characters. So season 2 in my mind falls a bit short on that, shorter than the other 3 in the first 4. I'm also not wild about the magical city of Qarth. I think it's one of the weaker storylines in the series as a whole, really. Qarth is a setting that really gets on my tits. Everybody has stupid long names with a million apostrophes in it. There is a council of blatantly evil wizards. The city just doesn't have any sort of depth to it, really. It never feels like, you know, like Winterfell, or it never feels like King's Landing, or even, you know, Marine, or those sort of places, where it feels like an actual functioning city where people live. Because I don't think we ever really see the citizens. We just see this stupid high council of elders and the wizard people, and it feels out of place, to be honest, for Game of Thrones, for me at least. I know it's from the books, I know it's a real George R.R. Martin setting, but it just, the whole thing doesn't work. And Dany's storyline is particularly weak, especially after the first season where she emerges. You know, you get this full character arc in her. Season 2 is where she just stagnates, and she does so, to be honest, for most of the rest of the show. The first season she's so brilliant, she's so vibrant as a character, and then she goes to Qarth and she just sort of shouts at people, and she meets a weird mask face lady, and that never goes anywhere. Everything else in season 2 is good. I'm just harping on all the shit that I don't like to justify why it's not higher on this list. And I couldn't have, like, you know, the top 4 are all Game of Thrones. They're not. The top ones aren't Game of Thrones, but it would have probably felt like that if this had gone any higher. And into the top 10 with The Boys, season 1. This was good. This was when I was talking about why I didn't really like Umbrella Academy. It's because when I watched that, I had just probably a month or a month and a half before watched The Boys, and I really like The Boys. I wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did, but it came strong out the bat. Any show that starts with a man literally running through someone and turning them into a cloud of flesh isn't here to fuck about. It gets right into it. It does not hang around for a moment. This, like Umbrella Academy, is based on a comic. Like Umbrella Academy, it's about, you know, sort of like, superheroes in the real world. What a bunch of misfits following some wacky characters on their adventures. But I think this show handles it a lot better. It feels like something that works for TV. Carl Urban's exceptionally questionable British accent aside, all the characters work. You know, all the plot lines more interesting than Umbrella Academy. Questions that it asks about the nature of, you know, superheroes and what that means for modern society, what we look to them for, what that says about us. The questions are more interesting. How it subverts expectations. I know, you know, dirty term right there, but it's built to subvert them, and it does it brilliantly. I have since cancelled my Amazon Prime subscription because I just wasn't watching anything on there, but when The Boys season 2 comes back around, or I guess when Mr. Robot comes back on, whatever comes first or last, I need to think this out to save the most money. Well, I'll be getting Amazon at some point to watch The Boys, that's what I'm trying to say. Number 9, Game of Thrones, season 3. We are back in it again. We went away for like one place and now we're back in the Game of Thrones with season 3. Why is it up here? Why is it not higher? Because season 3 is good, but there is a pattern of Game of Thrones seasons where it goes slow, big bang ending. Episode 9 is where you've got to like look out for like the big crazy moments, and season 3 definitely delivers on the big crazy moments, but the slow is probably among the slowest of the show. There are a lot of things that are technically good in like Robb Stark's story of like, you see him planning out his battles and you see him planning out his campaign, his war campaign, all things that a lot of other shows completely overlook. They just like focus on the battle, focus on the big hitting moment. Game of Thrones, in typical Game of Thrones fashion, takes a step back, looks at the reality of what would happen in a real sort of medieval situation, plays that out. But I think in season 3 it probably plays that out a little too much. It wouldn't be as high on this list if they weren't good episodes, if there weren't good things going on. I just think that other seasons of Game of Thrones manage the balance between slow, realistic and crazy big moments. I prefer this massively, that it would err on the side of caution. I prefer that massively to erring on the side of excess, as noted by the placements of the excessive seasons. But the reason that I don't harbour absolute adoration for season 3 is because it is probably the slowest season of the lot, and it suffers just a little bit because of it. Number 8 and number 7, Dark seasons 1 and 2. Dark is a show that's sort of been bubbling away. It's one of those shows that you hear about and you sort of get recommended here and there and not really know what it's about. It doesn't have a lot of mainstream buzz. It's sort of like a sleeper hit, I guess, partly because it's German, which limits its exposure somewhat, and partly because it's hard to sort of describe the appeal of what it's doing, because the easiest way to describe the show is German Stranger Things, which isn't entirely incorrect, but it's not just a fact of Stranger Things but happening in Germany. It's more Stranger Things with a German mindset, whereas Stranger Things itself is very peppy, very camp and American, and sort of like good times, nostalgia 1980s. Dark isn't just German, it feels almost stereotypically German. It's dark for a start. It's sort of bleak and depressing and sort of like an old weird German fairy tale where everything goes horribly wrong and everyone's left sort of disfigured and miserable. That's sort of the mindset. Whereas Stranger Things is looking at the 1980s like, hey man, remember the 80s? Remember New Coke? Yeah, nostalgia man. Dark is definitely looking at the 1980s like, yeah, I remember the 1980s. I remember the Cold War. And I remember Japan Airlines flight 123 going down in a single moment with the loss of 540 souls. That sort of sums up the feeling that's the difference between the two shows, whereas one is reveling in its chosen era and trying to, you know, put a positive spin on everything. Dark definitely goes back in time and says, yeah, it's sucked here, and then it goes back further. Life has always sucked, but it's not completely bleak. Whereas The Crown has had quite a choppy jump between, you know, young queen to middle-aged queen, and when it goes older it might have the similar sort of harsh jumps. Dark has some of the most incredibly well thought out casting in terms of, you know, there's time travel involved, there's children going missing, it's very, you know, Stranger Things, there's a other sort of dimension thing going on, and it plays around with time. The whole sort of central idea is that, you know, time travel and messing with time, and how it's affecting this small town, how it's already affected this small town that seems to be the centre of all these weird interdimensional things, how it is impacted on that town already countless times, and how it is woven into the fabric of everyone's lives without them even having the slightest idea. That's what makes Dark such a compelling watch, and because it messes around with time travel like this, it has to obviously cast characters as their younger selves, as their older selves, and it does it so well. Some of the casting is spot on. You get like people with, you know, the exact same sort of bone structure and the same sort of nose features and the same sort of head shape. It's crazy how well consistently cast each character is from, you know, generation to generation, or, you know, from young to old to whatever. It's something that can so easily go wrong, and when it's happening with this many characters, I don't think I've ever seen it done quite as well as this. And it's also kind of a head fuck trying to keep everything in order and, you know, remember who is related to who and who was with someone else in another timeline, who's where at any given moment. It's sort of taxing to keep track of everything, but it's well worth it. It's a very, very good show. It's exactly the sort of show that we should be, you know, travelling by word of mouth, becoming a sleeper hit, and I'm hoping that it does latch on to a big audience. If it hasn't done already, to be honest, I don't know, but I hope it does. Number 6, The Haunting of Hill House, Season 1. I watched this towards the start of the year, I'm thinking February. Didn't really know what to expect. I've not watched like any of like American Horror Story or any of the horror series that have come out, so this was my first introduction to that sort of modern horror series thing, and it was really good. It took me a couple of episodes to get into it, admittedly, but once I did, I was like fully on board for the rest of the show. It managed to be genuinely scary in some moments, but I think I wouldn't describe the series as actually scary. It's more just the unnerving aspect of it. The house is an intimidating entity, and how it's carried by each of the family members as they grow up or as they grow older. That unnerving sense of like a mix of like, oh, the supernatural stuff, but it's impacting them in real sort of tangible real life ways, whether it's, you know, addiction or a sense of superiority or fear or whatever it is. The mix of the sort of horror supernatural aspects of the show with the psychological were really well done. I know I've put like Haunting of Hill House Season 1 as how I've listed the show. I know there's another series coming out that isn't going to be based in Hill House. That story's done. It's going to be sort of like an anthology series, which is fine by me, absolutely. So yeah, I am waiting to see what they do next. Into the top 5, and we have Over the Garden Wall season. Well, no, that's not season 1. Over the Garden Wall. That's it. It's done. It was a one and done mini series that I first watched when it came out, and has become a staple for autumn Halloween watching ever since. I adore this show. It's just as good every time I watch it, if not better. For those who don't know, it was a mini series made by Cartoon Network, which I don't think they do regularly. I don't know if they've done since. It was released around Halloween time. I think it was just after Halloween it first aired. But it's a very autumnal show. It takes a lot of inspiration from like early animation and golden era Victorian sort of Americana. It's a very stylized piece. It's got nice little story, nice little sort of like fairy tale parable sort of story going on. It's got brilliant music, both the score and the featured songs within the story. It has a great sense of like evoking a bygone era in a sort of creepy, unnerving, but also approachable and comedic way. The main character is voiced by Elijah Wood, who does a really good job, but there's also guest stars in the form of John Cleese, Tim Curry, Christopher Lloyd, who plays the woodsman, who's a really interesting character. It's honestly the perfect thing to watch around Halloween time. I know we've passed that now this year, but for 2020, you can see it on Netflix, you can get a hold of it on DVD, probably catch it on Cartoon Network or whatever when it's on. It's got this great balance of like being dark and quite scary, quite foreboding in some places, but also balancing that out with some humour. Not over the top goofy stuff, just some, you know, good humoured content. It's probably comparable to something like Song of the Sea in terms of tone, or Book of Kells, mixed in with like, there's probably some inspiration from Spirited Away in there as well, but it's undoubtedly a very American show in terms of, you know, its style, how it presents itself, but also in terms of the whole Americana aspect of it. But yeah, cannot recommend Over the Garden Wall highly enough. Number 4 and number 3, Game of Thrones Season 1 and Game of Thrones Season 4. Yeah, this'll be it. Once we're done here, we're not talking about Game of Thrones for the rest of the video. These two are definitely the best of the whole show. Season 1 is a brilliant deconstruction of the whole honourable knight sort of tradition of storytelling. Ned Stark is this proud northern patriarchal man's man, calls a spade, if you see the spade. He's a man of duty, he's a man of honour, he's a rough around the edges, admirable kind of guy who you could see leading any number of stories in any number of settings. He is an archetypal leading fatherly figure, heroic kind of guy. Very likeable. Everybody likes Ned Stark. That's the point. He's called down to the capital, which is characterised as sort of like scheming, infested viper's den of people who are playing the Game of Thrones. Subterfuge and intrigue and all that sort of stuff. This cowardly climb to the top of the social ladder and big gruff, honourable Ned Stark goes down there to sort these people out, give them what for, and cleanse the capital, reclaim the throne for the side of duty and the side of justice and the side of honour. That would be a good show, but that is not Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is more interesting than that. Game of Thrones takes that whole concept and flips it on its head and says what would actually happen if someone like Ned Stark went to the capital, and let's just see it play out. And what happens is big, naive, duty-bound, honest Ned gets completely fucked over by these scheming douchebags who are just smarter than him. He comes to their turf to put the world to rights, and they are just better at the subterfuge, they are better at the intrigue, they are better at playing the game than him, and he pays the ultimate price. And that was shocking. I remember being absolutely blown away by that when it happened, because I was convinced, yeah, Ned Stark's the hero. I like Ned Stark. Ned Stark's going to sort everything out. Ned Stark's going to save me and be my dad. And then Game of Thrones was like, no, that's not going to happen. He is going to die gruesomely, and that is because he is a big dummy. And this is the show you're watching. And that was brilliant. Honestly, if Game of Thrones ended after that first season, it would still be a great show. Season 4 pips it, not because of any sort of grand meta reason like that, just because it's fucking really exciting. Whereas the other seasons of Game of Thrones have had this slow, big bang ending structure to them. Season 4 does have that, but it kicks off in such a crazy way. You've got Joffrey's death, you've got the trial of Tyrion that goes on, which, you know, it's more exciting than just waiting for things to happen and talking in rooms. You've got a real trial with real tension to it, and also the invasion, the planned invasion by the wildlings of the Wall, which is building up and gearing up, and you've got Jon Snow, you know, switching sides. Oh, he's going to align with. You've got Oberyn Martell, the only good thing to come out of Dawn. And in the space of like the last 3 episodes, you have the end of Tyrion's trial, you have the Mountain versus the Viper, one of the most insane, brutal one-on-one fights in the history of the show. You have the attack of the wildlings on the Wall, which is again a full-length brilliant battle scene that just keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole way through. You have the death of Mance Rayder, the death of Shae, the death of Tywin Lannister. Everything happens at the end of this season, season 4, and this has all been stuff that has been building up, and this is one hell of a payoff. I didn't even mention Brienne versus the Hound. It's another fantastic fight that happens at the end. So yeah, season 4 just about pips it, not because of any sort of smart meta creative reasons, just because it was super good to watch. Season 4 is Game of Thrones at its absolute Thronesiest peak, and yeah, it doesn't get much better than that. Number 2, Chernobyl. Chernobyl is the highest show ranked to come out this year. The number 1 show that I watched this year did not come out this year. Chernobyl was a godsend at the end of Game of Thrones. Could you tell that I was disappointed by the ending of Game of Thrones? You know what I said after that one, we're not talking about Game of Thrones anymore, so done. Chernobyl, standalone, on its own. Why is it good? Chernobyl is the best show about a nuclear reactor melting down that isn't actually about a nuclear reactor melting down. Chernobyl is a brilliant show about lies, about the impact of lies, particularly state lies, government lies, and how, as the show puts it, each lie told incurs a debt to the truth, and eventually that truth has to be repaid. That's one of those lines that really sticks with you from a show. And in Chernobyl, the lies were lies about the nuclear reactor core, about how the Soviet Union was such a paranoid state, so obsessed with appearing as strong and as good as its adversaries in the West, that it was willing to lie to its own people on a industrial scale, to the point that it was denying problems and capability limits of its own nuclear reactors, even to the operators of the equipment, even to the scientific community within the Soviet Union, and how those lies and those mistruths, more than any single other factor, were a contributor to the destruction and the devastation that happened in 1986 in Ukraine. But it's not just about the ideas. What also makes the show so good is the visceral nature in which it depicts the harrowing events, the panic, the fear, the horrific fallout from the event, not just the people immediately on site or the first responders or even the city as a whole, but a wider impact on the countries of Ukraine and Belarus, and how despite the lies of the Soviet regime being directly responsible for the destruction at Chernobyl, also how the structure of the country and how it had almost direct control over its people put it in a unique place to deal with that problem. How the collective Soviet mindset of the people made them willing to put themselves at risk to stop the spread of radiation, to stop the disaster from going worse. And I didn't know a lot about Chernobyl as a disaster, and I know that the show has taken some liberties, but it is a harrowing experience to watch and really interesting to learn about. I was looking up all sorts of stories, all sorts of footage from the events, looking up people. I know that not all of the main characters existed in real life, but they have contemporaries. Some are amalgamations of multiple people. But reading about these people, reading about the event, trying to find as much documentary footage as I could. The show was a real eye-opener, both as a historical lesson, but also as a TV show, as a dramatization in and of itself, not just about the disaster that it's referring to immediately, but also the ideas that it raises about government control, about lies, about how things that are done seemingly on a small scale eventually build up the mistruths, and how eventually it's everyone that pays for it in the end. So that was Chernobyl, the best show that came out this year, just by a smidge not the best show I have actually watched this year. Number 1, Neon Genesis Evangelion. Fucking just... That's honestly what it's like when I'm trying to think of things to say about Evangelion. It has blown my mind like I didn't actually know a show could. It's not just the best show that I've watched this year, it's the best show that I have watched for quite a number of years. It is like top 4, top 3 shows ever as far as I'm concerned. Though I knew its reputation of it's a big robot show, it's a big fighty robot anime, but it's not just a big robot fighty anime. There's more going on beneath the surface, and it's about the psychological elements and how the story impacts on the characters and all that introspective shit. And you can hear about it as much as you want, but until you sit down and actually watch Evangelion, it is almost indescribable, which makes it a terrible choice for number 1, because I've got to try and talk about it. The sweet irony of making a list of almost 60 seasons of television ranked bottom to top, and finishing it with Evangelion, a show which takes a quite considerably hard stance against the overconsumption of fiction. Whoopsie. So what is the show about? It's a 1990s anime series about a reluctant young chosen one who is plucked from obscurity to pilot a giant robot that his dad has built him so he can fight aliens. Not really selling that as like a great concept. It's also not what the show is about, even remotely. What the show does better than anything I have ever seen, is it gets into the headspace of someone who is clinically depressed. The creator Hideaki Anno had come to the show, creating the show off the back of a tumultuous couple of years creatively and professionally, where things just weren't going right for him. He fell into a state of depression, was given a chance to make the show, and during the process of creating it and writing it, he came across a textbook about clinical depression, realised that the symptoms he had were of that. I think at this point he'd probably broken out of it a little bit, but now that he had the book, he had the vocabulary to translate what was going on in his head into words on a page. The result is probably the most spectacular character analysis ever committed to TV. Shinji Ikari, the main character, and Masato and Rei and Asuka, the sort of major female characters, and to slightly a lesser extent Shinji's dad Gendo, are among the most complex and well thought out and well analysed and well structured characters. They are so well structured in terms of the plot and how the plot affects them. Investigating analysing their psychology. They are complete fucking messes of human beings. It's such a rich show in terms of like the depth of these characters and extrapolating that through the events, using the fantastical setting of a world being invaded by aliens, instead of just using it for awesome fight scenes, which it does. It uses the setting to really sort of delve deep, push the characters to their absolute mental limits, and then push them a little bit beyond that, show the fallout, put them up against the pressures of the plot. There's just so much to talk about that I can't do it in this short amount of time. Just sort of break things down and give the feel for what it's like to watch this show. In the end, none of the plot particularly matters, but the characters do, and the analysis does. And the show goes beyond just saying, you know, these characters are depressed, these characters are sad, ooh, how dark, how edgy. It goes beyond that, and it delves into why these characters are depressed, why they are the way they are in general, their backstories, but also how that informs their psychology, how their psychology affects how they react to aspects of the plot, how it affects how they react to each other, and the relationships that are built from those strained psychologies. It goes into like aspects of, you know, how we are almost dependent on retreating to a happy place, and how that can be sort of self-coddling. It's all about the bleakness and absolute necessity for continued human interaction, and how it's only through interacting with other people we achieve any sort of self-worth, but also how that can be incredibly difficult if you're not in a mentally prepared space to do that, and how it might look if you are forced to interact with other people and forced to make real genuine connections when you are in absolutely no way mentally capable, mentally mature enough, mentally prepared, mentally stable enough to do that. It's a 90s anime that didn't have a terribly high budget, but it overcomes that with some absolutely brilliantly skillful art direction, composition of shots, reserving of budget for the higher impact, higher marquee shots. Voice acting is brilliant, the soundtrack is exceptional, it's incredibly ambitious, and it pulls it off. That's all without going into like the impact it had on the anime industry, on opening up that sort of mainstream adult audience to the genre that really paved the way for the sort of anime that would become popular in the West. It's really on the level with, like, you know, Ghost in the Shell and Cowboy Bebop in terms of changing the game. The only things that I would say probably have more of an impact on bringing anime to the West are probably like Akira, obviously, and Studio Ghibli, but right underneath that I would say Evangelion is among probably the most impactful anime. And as a guy who's not terribly into anime, I can appreciate that, and I can definitely see why, but you know, as a show on its own without all that cultural context, it is still unbelievably brilliant. I could honestly go on about it forever if the battery wasn't dying on this camera. So that's, you know, my pick for the best show that I have watched in 2019.